My father handed out velvet boxes and luxury watches to everyone at the table, but left my spot completely bare. When my mother looked at me, she laughed and said I contributed absolutely nothing to the family prestige, so I deserved nothing in return. My younger sister smirked, and her husband made a condescending joke about my boring desk job. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply smiled, agreed with them, and walked out into the freezing winter night. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They had no idea that a few days later, a single mysterious box I sent would completely destroy their perfect lives, strip them of their wealth, and leave my father facing federal prison. My name is Maya. I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives who severely underestimated your true worth. The crystal chandelier above the dining table cast a warm glow over the massive holiday feast, but the atmosphere inside our family mansion in Buckhead was ice cold. It was Christmas evening. The air smelled of roasted duck and expensive pine. We sat around the custom mahogany table that my father Marcus loved to brag about to his wealthy friends. I sat at the far end quietly sipping my water. Next to me was my younger sister Chloe. She was the golden child dressed in a silk designer gown, radiating the entitlement she had been fed since birth. Beside her sat her white husband Bradley. My parents worshipped Bradley. To them he was the ultimate trophy, a handsome finance director who supposedly elevated our family status in the elite social circles of Atlanta. Dinner had just concluded when my father stood up at the head of the table. He clinked his crystal glass with a silver spoon to get our attention. His chest puffed out with pride as he reached over to a side table and picked up a stack of beautifully wrapped gifts. He cleared his throat and began his annual speech about the importance of family legacy and success. He spoke about how much the family business had grown and how proud he was of the people who truly contributed to our dynasty. He walked over to Bradley first. He handed him a heavy, dark green box. Bradley opened it with a theatrical gasp. Inside rested a gleaming gold Rolex watch. My father clapped Bradley on the shoulder, declaring him the son he never had and the financial genius of our company. Bradley gave a modest smile, but his eyes gleamed with greed. Next, my father turned to Chloe. He handed her a sleek velvet case. She ripped the ribbon off and pulled out a pair of dazzling diamond drop earrings. She squealed in delight, jumping up to hug our father. My mother Helen watched from the other end of the table, dabbing fake tears of joy from her eyes. She looked at Chloe like she was the greatest achievement of her life. Then my father sat back down. He picked up his wine glass and took a sip. I looked at the side table. It was completely empty. There were no more boxes. There were no more envelopes. I sat there for a long moment, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I looked directly at my father and asked him if there was a mistake. My mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence of the dining room. She set her wineglass down hard. She looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. "You really thought you were getting something, Maya?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "You contribute absolutely nothing to this family. You live in a basic apartment, you do not attend any of our charity galas, and your value to our social standing is practically zero. Why would we reward someone who refuses to elevate the family name? Do not expect anything when you offer nothing." Chloe chimed in, adjusting her new diamonds in the reflection of her phone screen. "Mom is right, Maya. You could at least try to dress up for once. You look like you just came from a shift at a local bank." The whole table erupted in laughter. Then Bradley leaned back in his custom leather dining chair. He swirled the expensive scotch in his glass and looked at me with a patronizing smirk. "Come on, guys, give Maya a break. It takes a lot of energy to punch numbers into a calculator all day. We cannot all handle high-stakes investments. Her boring little number-crunching job is probably very stressful." He chuckled, looking around the table for approval. My father nodded vigorously, agreeing with his perfect son-in-law. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. To them, I was just the dark-skinned disappointment, the rebellious daughter who refused to join the family real estate business. They thought I was a low-level clerk at some nameless accounting firm. They did not know that I was a senior forensic auditor for one of the largest corporate investigative firms in the country. My entire career was built on tracking hidden money, exposing financial fraud, and dismantling corrupt corporations. I could read a fake ledger like a simple picture book, and I had been reading theirs for the past 6 months. I looked at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I saw my father drunk on fake prestige, my mother whose love was transactional, my sister absorbed in vanity, and Bradley draining them dry. I did not cry. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and smiled a cold, empty smile. "You are right, Mom," I said. "My value is 0. I turned my back and walked into the freezing Atlanta night forever. The freezing wind whipped against my face as I marched down the long manicured driveway of my parents' estate. The crisp air felt like absolute freedom. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, echoing in the quiet, opulent neighborhood. I did not look back at the massive brick mansion with its glowing windows and fake warmth. I kept walking past the row of luxury vehicles parked near the entrance, past Bradley and his newly acquired Rolex, past my father and his inflated ego. I walked 2 blocks down the street until I reached the discreet corner where I always parked. I pressed the key fob in my pocket. The sleek headlights of my jet-black Porsche Panamera flashed to life, illuminating the dark street. My family thought I drove a beat-up sedan because that was the only car I ever brought to their house. I purposely kept my actual life completely hidden from them. They wanted me to be a struggling peasant, so I played the part flawlessly. I slid into the driver's seat, savoring the smell of rich leather and the soft hum of the high-performance engine. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I tapped on my mother's name and hit block. Then I did the same for my father, my sister, and finally Bradley. I watched their names disappear into the digital void one by one. With a few simple taps, I completely severed my ties to the people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was nothing. I placed the phone in the cup holder and pulled out onto the empty street. The heated steering wheel warmed my frozen hands as I drove toward downtown Atlanta. I turned on the radio to drown out the silence. A classic holiday choir was singing about joy and togetherness. I immediately switched the station. The cheerful melody was replaced by a smooth rhythm and blues track, but the damage was already done. The music triggered a flood of memories I had tried to keep buried. I remembered being 9 years old, standing in the hallway of that same mansion. My mother had just bought matching holiday dresses for a family portrait. Chloe was handed a beautiful ivory gown that made her bright eyes and lighter skin glow. When I asked for mine, my mother handed me a plain dark navy dress. She told me the light colors did not suit my complexion, and that I needed to blend into the background so I would not ruin the aesthetic of the photo. I remembered how my father would proudly introduce Chloe to his wealthy business partners, showing off her blonde highlights and her perfect smile. When it came to me, he would quickly change the subject or send me to the kitchen to fetch drinks like I was the hired help. They always made sure I knew my place. Chloe was the beautiful golden child, destined for high society, while I was the dark-skinned, awkward mistake they had to tolerate. They fed Chloe everything she ever wanted and starved me of any affection. So I learned to feed myself. I threw all my pain into my education. I studied late into the night while Chloe was out partying. I earned scholarships they never knew about. I built an entire empire of my own in the shadows while they were busy polishing their fake crowns. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my luxury high-rise building. The security guard nodded respectfully as I drove past. I took the private elevator up to my penthouse apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. This was my sanctuary, a sanctuary built entirely on my own merit without a single dime from my father. I dropped my coat on the plush sofa and walked straight to my home office. I sat down at my glass desk and woke up my iPad. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I opened the encrypted folder I had been meticulously curating for the past 6 months. The documents were all there, perfectly organized and damning. There were the bank statements showing the massive $4 million loan my father and Bradley had taken out against the family business. There were the legal contracts where they had blatantly forged my signature, naming me as the primary guarantor. They thought I was too stupid to ever find out. They assumed they could use my clean credit to fund their lavish lifestyles and leave me holding the bag if everything collapsed. I swiped to the next file. This one was my personal favorite. It was the detailed trace of where that $4 million had actually gone. Bradley had not invested a single cent into the company. He had systematically funneled the money through a series of shell companies straight into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under his own name. He was draining my family dry and preparing to run, while my parents blindly praised him as their savior. I opened the courier application on my screen. I had already prepared the physical documents earlier this week. They were nestled inside a beautiful velvet-wrapped box that looked exactly like a high-end Christmas gift. I selected the delivery address, typing in the coordinates of the Buckhead mansion I had just walked away from. I selected the delivery date for Boxing Day, bright and early in the morning. I wanted them to have one last peaceful night of sleep before their entire world shattered. I reviewed the order one final time. The IRS notice of intent to levy, the forged loan documents, the offshore wire transfers. Everything was ready to detonate. I tapped confirm. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the glowing city lights. I let the heavy childhood burden slip off my shoulders. "Merry Christmas, Marcus," I whispered to the empty room. The sun rose over Buckhead, bringing a crisp, peaceful Boxing Day morning. Inside the mansion, the remnants of the lavish Christmas dinner were still scattered across the dining room. Empty champagne flutes and wrapping paper littered the expensive rugs. My parents usually spent the day after Christmas nursing their hangovers and tallying the value of the gifts they received. Helen lounged in the sunroom, wrapped in a silk robe, flipping through a fashion magazine. Marcus was in the kitchen brewing a fresh pot of imported espresso. He felt invincible. He believed his kingdom was secure, and his legacy was untouchable. The heavy brass knocker echoed through the quiet house, breaking the morning silence. Chloe, who was admiring her new diamond earrings in the mirror, answered the door. A courier stood on the porch holding an elegant dark red velvet box wrapped with a gold ribbon. It looked exactly like a high-end jewelry case. The courier asked for a signature, left the box in her hands, and walked away. Chloe shut the door and smiled to herself. She immediately assumed the box was another late Christmas present, perhaps a surprise bonus gift from Bradley, or a peace offering from some wealthy family friend who missed the dinner party. She carried the velvet box into the living room where my father and Bradley were sitting. Bradley was wearing his new Rolex, admiring how the light caught the gold dial. My father held his espresso cup, discussing their upcoming golf tournament. "Look what just arrived," Chloe announced. She sat on the edge of the leather sofa and carefully untied the gold ribbon. She was expecting a diamond bracelet or maybe the keys to a car. Instead, she flipped open the velvet lid and found a thick stack of aggressively stamped legal documents folded neatly inside. Chloe frowned. She pulled the heavy parchment out of the box and stared at the bold red letters printed across the top of the very first page. It was not a greeting card. It was an official notice of intent to levy from the Internal Revenue Service. Her eyes skimmed down the page and the color instantly drained from her face. "What is all this?" she muttered, flipping to the second page. Her confusion quickly turned into raw panic. "Dad, what does this mean? Why does this say $4 million?" Marcus stopped mid-sentence. He lowered his espresso cup, his brow furrowing in irritation. "What are you talking about, Chloe? Give me that." He walked over and snatched the papers from her manicured hands. He put on his reading glasses and looked at the top sheet. The silence in the living room became absolute and suffocating. I had made sure the documents were impossible to misunderstand. The very first file was the IRS notice, demanding immediate payment for massive tax discrepancies. But the second file was the real dagger. It was a complete copy of the loan agreement Marcus and Bradley had executed with a major private bank. The paperwork detailed a $4 million commercial loan taken out against our family real estate business. And right there on the signature line for the primary guarantor was my name. Maya. My father stared at the blatantly forged signature. His hands began to tremble. I had included a certified forensic analysis of the signature proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it had been falsified. I also included the specific penal codes for wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft printed clearly in the margins. The expensive porcelain espresso cup slipped from my father's fingers. It shattered against the imported hardwood floor, sending dark brown liquid splashing across the pristine rugs. He let out a choked gasp, backing away from the documents, as if they were physically burning him. Helen rushed into the room, drawn by the sound of breaking porcelain. "What is going on?" she demanded, looking from the spilled coffee to her husband's pale face. Marcus could not even speak. He was hyperventilating, clutching his chest, as the reality of federal prison suddenly loomed over his perfect life. Bradley stood up quickly, trying to take control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. He adjusted his collar and put on his best authoritative voice. "Everyone just calm down," he commanded, stepping forward to examine the papers. He grabbed the stack from Marcus and quickly flipped through the pages. For a moment, Bradley looked like a cornered animal, but he quickly masked it with his signature arrogant smirk. "It is just a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "It is a clerical error from the bank. You know how these auditors are, they love to make a big deal out of simple administrative oversights." Helen looked at her perfect son-in-law, desperate for reassurance. "Are you sure, Bradley?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We cannot have an IRS scandal attached to our name. The country club board would completely strip us of our membership." "I am completely sure," Bradley replied, flashing a reassuring smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I will make a few calls to my buddies in finance on Monday. We will get this sorted out over a round of drinks. Maya is probably just throwing a tantrum because she felt left out last night, and she managed to dig up some outdated preliminary paperwork. Leave it to me, I handle these corporate suits all the time." He sounded convincing to a family that was desperate to believe him. They wanted the white savior to step in and fix the mess. But as Bradley stood there promising salvation, Chloe noticed something terrifying. She looked down at his hands holding the legal documents. The crisp white papers were rattling. Bradley's knuckles were completely white and his hands were shaking violently. Beneath his calm, arrogant exterior, he knew exactly what those documents meant. He knew the money was already gone, he knew the federal government was directly involved, and he knew he had just been caught. The illusion of control evaporated the moment Bradley dropped the papers onto the glass coffee table. The loud smack of the heavy stack hitting the glass made everyone jump. Marcus paced the room, running his hands over his balding head, his chest heaving with every breath. Helen demanded someone call me immediately, screaming that I had clearly made a catastrophic error at my stupid little accounting job. Chloe grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed my number. She put the phone on speaker so the entire room could hear me apologize and agree to fix what they still desperately wanted to believe was my clerical mistake. The phone rang exactly one time before going straight to an automated voicemail. Chloe frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in frustration, and dialed again. Voicemail. She frantically typed out a text message demanding I drive back to the mansion immediately and sign a retroactive liability waiver to clear Bradley's name. The message instantly bounced back as completely undelivered. I had blocked them all, and the digital silence in that room was deafening. Marcus snatched his own phone from his pocket and tried calling me himself. When he heard the same automated greeting, he let out a guttural yell and threw his phone directly across the living room. The device smashed against the stone fireplace, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. They were completely trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They desperately needed my physical signature to validate their forged loan and stop the impending federal audit, but they had absolutely no way to reach the daughter they had just cruelly kicked out into the freezing cold. The crushing reality began to set in for my father. He could no longer command me. While they were spiraling into a full-blown panic attack in their Buckhead mansion, I was sitting comfortably in my corner office on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. The bright morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, illuminating my heavy mahogany desk and the four large monitors displaying complex financial tracking models. I took a slow sip of my expensive matcha latte and watched the global market tickers scroll endlessly across my top screen. I felt absolutely zero guilt. I had mourned the loss of my toxic family many months ago. My investigation started in late June, when I noticed a highly suspicious discrepancy in a public tax filing for my father's real estate business. He always bragged endlessly about his massive profit margins to his wealthy friends, but the public numbers I saw did not align with his highly lavish lifestyle at all. Out of pure professional curiosity, I ran a deep background check using my own secured corporate databases. What I uncovered made my blood run incredibly cold. There it was, staring back at me in black and white. A $4 million commercial loan with my exact name and social security number listed as the primary guarantor. My own father had maliciously used my completely spotless credit history and my zero debt ratio to secure a massive financial payout for himself and his golden white son-in-law. I spent the next 6 grueling months quietly tearing apart their entire financial structure layer by layer. I used my advanced skills as a senior forensic accountant to meticulously trace every single stolen penny. I legally accessed bank records and found the exact internet protocol addresses used to electronically submit the forged loan documents. I tracked the routing numbers directly to the hidden offshore shell accounts located in the Cayman Islands. I built an ironclad, legally binding case that could easily put both Marcus and Bradley away in a federal penitentiary for decades. But I did not go to the authorities right away. A small, remarkably naive part of my heart wanted to give them one final chance to prove they loved me. I wanted to see if they valued me as a human being at all. I waited patiently for Christmas Day. I sat at that extravagant dinner table waiting for just one kind word or one genuine moment of inclusion from my parents. If my father had handed me a simple gift, or if my mother had looked at me with real affection, I might have confronted them privately in my office. I might have given them a strict payment plan to return the stolen money quietly without getting the federal government involved. But instead they chose to publicly humiliate me. They laughed directly in my face and told me my value was exactly zero. That brutal rejection was the final closure I desperately needed. They cheerfully handed me the match, so I lit it and threw it right onto their fragile paper castle. I minimized the dense financial spreadsheets on my primary monitor and opened my private security application. I had perfectly anticipated their next panicked move. They could not reach me by phone, so they would inevitably try to ambush me in person to intimidate me into signing their fake documents. They mistakenly thought I still worked at the tiny, depressing strip mall accounting firm I had fabricated years ago to keep them completely off my back. But they were about to discover exactly who the scapegoat really was. A loud notification pinged on my tablet screen. It was a live high-definition video feed from the advanced security cameras located in my corporate building's underground parking garage. I watched the crisp footage intently as my father's familiar silver Mercedes-Benz abruptly bypassed the visitor gate and aggressively sped into the restricted VIP parking area. Marcus, Helen, and Chloe piled out of the vehicle looking completely unhinged and absolutely desperate. They were marching aggressively toward the private glass elevators, demanding immediate access from my highly trained and very confused security guards. I smiled as I picked up my desk phone to make a call. The war had officially arrived on my turf. I pressed the button on my phone console, connecting directly to the main lobby security desk. "Send them up," I instructed, my tone completely flat. I did not want them dragged out by security. I wanted them to step off that elevator and see exactly what kind of empire I commanded. I wanted them to feel how small their little real estate fraud was compared to the multi-billion-dollar corporate investigations I handled every single day. I smoothed my tailored suit jacket and walked out of my office, stepping into the expansive main lobby of my firm. A few moments later, the brushed steel doors of the private elevator slid open. My mother, Helen, and my sister, Chloe, stormed out looking like absolute maniacs. They were fully prepared to deploy their classic narcissistic control tactic, which was to cause a massive, shameful public scene, so I would panic and immediately submit to their demands. Helen was already shouting before she even fully cleared the elevator doors. "Where is she?" Helen yelled, her voice echoing off the Italian marble floors. "Where is Maya? She has made a catastrophic error and she is going to fix it right now." Chloe was right behind her, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. They expected to find me huddled in a tiny, depressing cubicle surrounded by cheap filing cabinets. Instead, they found themselves standing in the center of a breathtaking, ultra-modern corporate penthouse. Dozens of highly paid forensic accountants, lawyers, and financial analysts paused their work to stare at the two hysterical women screaming in the reception area. The sheer display of corporate power threw them off balance for a split second, but my mother quickly recovered. Her entitlement ran far too deep to let reality stop her. She spotted me standing calmly near the reception desk and pointed a trembling, manicured finger in my direction. "There you are," Helen snarled, marching aggressively toward me. "You stupid, ungrateful girl! Do you have any idea what kind of mess you have created with your little mail prank?" Two large security guards immediately moved to intercept them, but I raised my hand. "Stand down," I told the guards. "I will handle this." I turned to my mother and sister, my expression completely blank. "We are not doing this in the lobby," I said smoothly. "Follow me." I turned my back on them and walked toward the massive soundproof glass conference room at the center of the floor. I did not check to see if they were following me. I knew they would. They hurried after me, their high heels clicking furiously against the polished floor. I opened the heavy glass door and gestured for them to enter. The moment they stepped inside, I closed the door, shutting out the ambient noise of the office. Helen slammed both of her hands down on the sleek mahogany conference table. Her face was flushed with rage. "I do not know what kind of sick joke you think you are playing, Maya," she hissed, "but you are going to call the bank right now. You are going to tell them you made a mistake, and you are going to sign the proper retroactive liability waiver. You are going to clear Bradley's name, and you are going to fix this IRS disaster before it destroys the family legacy." Chloe crossed her arms and glared at me with pure disdain. "You are so pathetic, Maya. You have always been jealous of me and Bradley. Just because you are miserable and alone does not mean you can forge fake government documents to ruin our Christmas. You need to stop acting like a jealous child and do what Mom says. You owe us." I stood on the opposite side of the table, simply watching them. I let them scream. I let them exhaust their pathetic little arsenal of insults and guilt trips. They were using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics they had used on me since I was a little girl. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my eyes, apologize, and desperately beg for their forgiveness. But the frightened little girl they used to bully was long gone. I pulled out the plush leather chair at the head of the table and sat down, crossing my legs. I did not say a single word until they finally ran out of breath. The silence in the glass room grew thick and uncomfortable. Helen stared at me, waiting for my tearful apology. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My mother blinked, completely taken aback by my absolute lack of emotion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany. "You really came all the way down here thinking you could bully me into going to federal prison for a crime your husband committed. You honestly believe I am going to sacrifice my entire career and my freedom to save a crumbling real estate business that I do not even own? You think I care about a family legacy that consists of nothing but lies, debt, and fake prestige? You are completely delusional." Helen opened her mouth to scream again, but I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. I reached into my briefcase, which I had brought with me from my office. I pulled out a thick red folder. It was the companion to the velvet box I had sent them that morning. This folder contained the exact forensic breakdown of every transaction. I placed the red folder on the table. I placed my hand flat on top of it and looked directly into my sister's arrogant eyes. "I am not taking the fall for Dad," I said coldly. "But you should really be asking where Bradley put the $4 million." I slid the folder across the smooth table directly into Chloe's hands. Chloe looked down at the bright red folder as if it were a venomous snake. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before her manicured fingers flipped it open. Helen leaned over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers and banking codes. I did not give them a chance to misinterpret the data. I walked them through every single page with the cold precision of a surgeon. I pointed to the first highlighted column, explaining how the $4 million loan was initially deposited into my father's primary business account. I then pointed to the second page, showing how exactly 48 hours later the entire sum was wired out. It did not go into the family portfolio. It did not go toward buying new properties or paying off existing debts. Instead, it was systematically broken down into smaller, untraceable increments and funneled directly into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. "Where do these accounts lead?" Helen asked, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. She was not a financial expert, but even she could see the blatant irregularities. "Turn to page 5, I instructed, leaning back in my leather chair. Chloe turned the page. Her eyes widened as she stared at the official corporate registry documents I had pulled from the Cayman Islands database. These companies were registered under a single holding corporation, and the sole proprietor of that holding corporation was Bradley. The money was gone. Bradley had legally completely insulated himself, while leaving my father entirely exposed with a massive fraudulent loan tied directly to my forged signature. I watched as the puzzle pieces slowly fell into place inside their minds. I reminded them of Bradley's sudden lavish spending over the past few months. The impromptu luxury trips, the custom-tailored suits, the expensive new car he claimed was a company bonus. It was all funded by the money he stole from his own father-in-law. The silence in the conference room was shattered by a loud, harsh laugh. Chloe violently shoved the red folder away from her. Paper spilled across the mahogany table. She stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "You are completely psychotic, Maya," she spat, her face contorting with absolute rage. "You actually sat here and completely fabricated all of this. You doctored these bank records just to frame my husband." "I did not doctor anything, Chloe," I replied calmly. "Those are certified bank records. You can call the institutions yourself and verify every single routing number." "Shut up!" Chloe screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "You are just a bitter, jealous spinster. You have always been obsessed with me. You have always hated Bradley because he is successful and handsome, and he actually chose me. You cannot stand the fact that I have a perfect marriage and a perfect life while you have absolutely nothing. So you spent months faking government documents to try and destroy my happiness. You are pathetic." Helen was quick to back her golden child. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with furious indignation. "I cannot believe I raised such a toxic monster," she hissed. "Your sister is right. You have always tried to tear this family apart out of pure spite. Bradley has done nothing but elevate our family name. He has brought us prestige and respect. And you are so consumed by your miserable, lonely existence that you would rather see your father go to federal prison than admit you made a mistake. You are going to call the bank right now, Maya. You are going to sign that waiver, and you are going to apologize to your sister for this disgusting charade." I looked at the two women standing before me. They were presented with undeniable concrete proof that their precious white savior was actively robbing them blind and preparing to leave them completely ruined. Yet they still chose to attack me. Their deep-rooted prejudice and their desperate need to maintain their fake high society image completely blinded them to reality. They would rather sink with a handsome thief than be saved by the dark-skinned daughter they despised. "I am not calling anyone," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The IRS is already conducting their preliminary audit. The bank fraud division has been notified. The wheels are already in motion, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Bradley played you both for absolute fools. Your perfect husband is a parasite, Chloe, and your perfect legacy, Helen, is nothing but a mountain of stolen cash and lies. The truth hit my mother like a physical blow. The absolute finality in my voice stripped away her last remaining shred of denial. She realized I was not bluffing. She realized her entire world was on the verge of total catastrophic collapse, and she had absolutely zero control over the situation. The realization broke her. Helen lunged forward across the table. Her hand moved in a blur of motion. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed loudly through the soundproof glass room. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. The sting was immediate and intense. Chloe gasped, stepping back from the table. "You are dead to me," Helen screamed, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with uncontrolled rage. "You hear me, Maya? You are absolutely dead to me. You are no longer my daughter." I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to defend myself. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I felt heat radiating from my cheek, but I did not let emotion break through my composed exterior. I reached up and gently touched my stinging face. Then I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes and gave her a slow, chilling smile. "Security has this whole assault on camera," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Get out of my building before I press charges." The ride back to the Buckhead mansion was completely silent. My mother and sister sat in the back of their luxury vehicle, staring blankly out the tinted windows. The mark on Helen's face was a reminder that their manipulation tactics no longer worked on me. Despite the overwhelming mountain of evidence I had just shoved directly into their hands, they flatly refused to process the reality of the situation. Their minds simply could not comprehend that the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage for over 3 decades was actually a high-powered corporate executive holding their entire fate in her hands. The entire power dynamic they had carefully established to keep me oppressed had evaporated in an instant. It was much easier for them to believe that I was a psychotic, bitter mastermind orchestrating a massive conspiracy than to admit they had been conned by the boy they worshipped. When they finally walked through the front doors of the mansion, the house felt suffocating and cold. Helen immediately retreated to her master bedroom, locking the door behind her to hide her bruised ego and her absolute terror. Chloe, however, marched straight toward the home office, clutching the red folder tightly against her chest. She desperately needed Bradley to look her in the eye and tell her it was all a giant lie. Bradley was sitting behind my father's expensive oak desk, pretending to review some construction contracts. When Chloe burst into the room, he quickly minimized the browser window on his laptop. Chloe threw the red folder onto the desk. Her voice shook as she demanded an explanation for the offshore bank accounts and the massive wire transfers. For a brief second, genuine panic flashed across his face. He had not expected me to have the actual routing numbers, but he was a master manipulator, and he quickly recovered his composure. He stood up, walked around the desk, and gently took Chloe's trembling hands in his own. He did not get angry or defensive. Instead, he let his shoulders slump and forced real tears to well up in his blue eyes. He played the ultimate victim perfectly. He told Chloe that I had illegally hacked into his personal computer and deliberately fabricated those documents specifically to ruin his life. He claimed I was deeply bitter and intensely jealous of their beautiful interracial marriage. He spun a pathetic sob story about how I could not stand seeing my younger sister happy with a successful white man, so I was trying to frame him for my own corporate financial crimes. He pulled Chloe into his chest, stroking her blonde hair, and whispering that they needed to stick together against my evil, relentless sabotage. Chloe, desperate to keep her perfect high society life intact, swallowed the toxic lie completely. She wrapped her arms around him, sobbing quietly into his tailored shirt, apologizing profusely for ever doubting his loyalty. The golden child was blind to the smiling monster holding her. A few hours later, while Chloe was upstairs fixing her ruined makeup, Marcus slipped into the home office. My father had not spoken a single word since he dropped his espresso cup that morning. Unlike my mother and sister, Marcus actually understood how commercial banking worked. He knew the Internal Revenue Service did not send out official notices of intent to levy based on fake documents. He knew the $4 million was genuinely missing from the company ledgers. And deep down in the darkest corner of his mind, he knew Bradley was the only person with the security clearance to move that kind of money offshore. Marcus carefully closed the heavy oak doors behind him and locked them securely. He looked at his perfect son-in-law. The fake tears were gone from Bradley's face, now replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Marcus did not yell. He did not aggressively accuse Bradley of grand theft or demand a tearful confession. He was far too terrified of the impending federal audit for any righteous anger. He walked over to the desk, his hands shaking visibly. He looked like a broken old man, stripped of all his arrogance and pride. Marcus begged him. He pleaded with Bradley in a hushed, desperate whisper to simply wire the $4 million back into the main corporate account just for a few short weeks. He frantically promised Bradley he would not ask any questions about why the money was moved in the first place or who helped him set up the offshore accounts. He told Bradley that if the money was simply sitting in the correct account when the federal auditors arrived, they could easily brush the forged signature off as a simple internal administrative filing error and save the company from total financial liquidation. He was practically on his knees offering the thief complete amnesty if he would just return the stolen funds and save him from federal prison. Bradley leaned back in the luxurious leather desk chair and steepled his fingers together. He watched my father squirm and beg with a look of absolute disgust on his face. He had spent years playing the respectful, obedient son-in-law, but he did not need the disguise anymore. He had the money and he had the exit strategy secured. Bradley dropped his charming persona entirely. He did not offer any comfort or any false hope. He stood up and slowly walked around the desk until he was standing just inches away from the trembling old man. He looked his father-in-law dead in the eye with a chilling, empty expression. "Your name is on the forgery, Marcus," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Not mine. You are going down alone." He turned his back on the broken old man and began calmly packing his expensive leather briefcase with his essential documents. He knew his flight out of the country was approaching, and he had no intention of sticking around for the federal raid. He knew his flight out of the country was approaching, and he had no intention of sticking around for the federal raid. The raid happened exactly 48 hours later. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, and the downtown financial district was buzzing with wealthy executives getting their morning coffee. My father's real estate headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a prominent glass building right in the heart of the city. Marcus had arrived early, eager to project an image of absolute stability to his staff. He was sitting in his corner office sipping his imported espresso when the elevator doors chimed open. But it was not his usual parade of sycophantic junior partners stepping off the elevator. It was a tactical team of federal agents wearing dark blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs. They moved with terrifying efficiency. Before the receptionist could even reach for her telephone, the agents had completely locked down the entire floor. They flashed their federal warrants and began systematically seizing every single piece of electronic equipment in the office. They pulled desktop computers from their stations, confiscated external hard drives, and packed thousands of physical files into heavy cardboard boxes. The pristine, perfectly quiet office was suddenly transformed into an active crime scene. Marcus stood frozen behind his massive mahogany desk as 2 armed federal agents walked directly into his private office. He tried to summon his usual arrogant authority, demanding to know who was in charge and threatening to call his high-priced corporate lawyers. The lead agent did not even blink. He simply read Marcus his Miranda rights, pulled his arms behind his back, and locked a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The cold click of the metal echoed in the silent room. My father, the man who had spent his entire life obsessing over his flawless public image, was marched out of his own office like a common criminal. The federal agents paraded him through the center of the bullpen right in front of all his shocked employees. People held up their smartphones recording the mighty Marcus being perp walk toward the elevators. By the time they reached the ground floor, local news crews had already caught wind of the raid. Cameras flashed brightly as the agents escorted him out of the lobby and pushed him into the back of a waiting federal vehicle. His carefully cultivated high society reputation was completely destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The footage of his humiliating arrest was broadcasted across every local news network in Atlanta by noon. While Marcus was sitting in a federal holding cell, my mother Helen was losing her mind inside the Buckhead mansion. She was watching the news coverage on her massive television, completely unable to comprehend the spectacular collapse of her perfect world. In her twisted narcissistic mind, she still absolutely refused to blame the white son-in-law, who had actually stolen the money. Instead, she directed all her venomous fury directly at me. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I ignored the call knowing it was her. A minute later, a notification popped up indicating a new voicemail message. I poured myself a generous glass of expensive red wine and walked over to the kitchen island. I tapped the screen and pressed play. Helen's voice filled my quiet apartment. She was completely unhinged, violently alternating between hysterical sobbing and vicious screaming. "Maya, you have to fix this right now," she sobbed into the receiver, her voice cracking with desperation. "They took your father. They put him in handcuffs on national television. This is entirely your fault. You did this to us." Her tone suddenly shifted from pleading tears to raw, venomous rage. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. You are going to march down to the federal courthouse right this second and confess to everything. You are going to tell them you forged those documents and you manipulated the accounts. You owe us this, Maya. We fed you, we clothed you, and we let you live in our beautiful house for 18 years. You were nothing but a burden to this family, but we tolerated you anyway. It is time for you to finally pay us back. If you do not take the fall for your father, I swear I will destroy whatever pathetic little career you have built for yourself. I will make sure you never work in this city again." The voicemail ended with a loud click followed by a heavy digital silence. She actually believed her threats still held weight. She thought she could simply command me to go to federal prison just to save her social standing at the country club. I stood in my beautifully decorated apartment, completely unbothered by her toxic emotional extortion. I took a slow sip of my red wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor. The girl they had abused for decades would have cried hearing those cruel words. She would have internalized the guilt and questioned her own sanity. But that girl was dead. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculating resolve. I placed my wine glass on the marble counter and picked up my phone. I opened my email application and drafted a new message. I attached the audio file of Helen's unhinged voicemail directly to the email. I typed a brief, highly professional note explaining the context of the recording. I addressed the email directly to Special Agent Thomas, the lead FBI investigator assigned to my father's corporate fraud case. I had been quietly cooperating with him for weeks, providing the forensic evidence that made the raid possible. I hit the send button. The email vanished instantly, delivering my mother's toxic threats straight to the federal government. I smiled, taking another sip of my wine. Helen wanted to play hardball, but she did not realize she had just handed me rock-solid evidence of witness tampering and felony extortion. It took 48 hours for my father's high-priced defense attorneys to finally secure his release from federal custody. The bail was set at a staggering $2 million. Because the government had immediately frozen every single corporate and personal bank account tied to the family name, Marcus had to surrender the deed to a secondary commercial property just to cover the massive bond. When he finally walked through the front doors of the Buckhead mansion, he was a broken man. He looked 10 years older. His suit was wrinkled, and he reeked of stale sweat and sheer panic. Helen did not rush to embrace him. Instead, she paced the living room floor frantically, demanding to know how they were going to pay the mortgage and the household staff. They had absolutely zero liquid cash. Every credit card had been canceled. Every investment portfolio was locked down, pending the ongoing criminal investigation. The reality of their sudden poverty hung in the air like a thick, toxic cloud. Chloe could not handle the suffocating tension. She had spent her entire life completely shielded from consequence and discomfort. As Marcus and Helen engaged in a vicious screaming match in the grand foyer, Chloe decided she simply needed to escape for the afternoon. She grabbed her designer handbag and drove her Range Rover to the most exclusive luxury spa in downtown Atlanta. She intended to book a comprehensive full-day package complete with a hot stone massage and a caviar facial just to de-stress from the horrible family drama. She confidently approached the marble reception desk and handed the attendant her sleek metal platinum credit card. The receptionist swiped the card and politely waited. A loud, obnoxious beep echoed from the machine. Declined. Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes, and blamed the machine. She dug into her expensive leather wallet and produced a black titanium card. The receptionist swiped it again. Declined. Chloe threw 3 more cards onto the counter, her face flushing with hot embarrassment as the other wealthy patrons in the lobby began to stare. Every single card was hard declined by the issuing banks. Furious and completely humiliated, Chloe stormed out of the spa. She sat in the driver's seat of her car and aggressively tapped on her banking application to check her balances. The screen loaded slowly. When the dashboard finally appeared, her jaw dropped in absolute horror. Her personal checking account, which usually held hundreds of thousands of dollars, showed a balance of exactly 0. She frantically tried to log into the joint investment accounts she shared with Bradley. Access denied. Invalid password. A cold knot of genuine terror began to form in her stomach. She realized she had absolutely 0 access to the money Bradley managed. He had always handled all their finances, insisting that a beautiful woman like her should never have to worry about complicated banking details. She had happily handed over all her passwords and routing numbers years ago, blindly trusting the white savior her parents adored. Chloe slammed her foot on the gas pedal and sped back to the mansion. She burst through the front doors, ignoring her parents, who were still bitterly arguing in the kitchen. She ran straight up the grand, sweeping staircase to the master suite she shared with Bradley. She expected to find him sitting at his desk making angry phone calls to fix the bank errors. Instead, she found the bedroom completely ransacked. The closet doors were thrown wide open, and all of Bradley's expensive custom-tailored suits were gone. Bradley stood near the center of the room, hurriedly stuffing items into a sleek black leather duffel bag. Chloe froze in the doorway. She watched as her perfect husband tossed a thick stack of banded $100 bills into the bag. Beside the cash were 3 cheap plastic burner phones and his blue American passport. "Bradley," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" "My cards were all declined and the joint accounts are completely locked. We need to call the bank." Bradley stopped packing. He slowly zipped the duffel bag closed and turned to face her. The charming, affectionate smile he usually wore for her was completely gone. His eyes were cold and dead. "I am leaving, Chloe," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I suggest you pack a bag too, before the feds come to seize this house." Chloe stepped forward, her mind desperately refusing to accept what she was seeing. "Leaving," she repeated, shaking her head in denial. "You cannot leave. We are married. We are a team. You promised you would fix this mess with the IRS. You said Maya was lying about the offshore accounts. You promised me Bradley. We built a whole life together." Bradley let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. "You really are that stupid, aren't you?" he sneered. "Maya was not lying. I took the $4 million. I took everything from your personal accounts, too. Every single dime is sitting safely in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation you will never find." Chloe let out a high-pitched gasp. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his jacket. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "I am your wife. I love you. Bradley looked down at her with absolute disgust. He reached up and violently grabbed her wrists, ripping her hands off his jacket. He shoved her backward with brutal force. Chloe stumbled in her high heels and crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, scraping her knees. I never loved you, Bradley spat, standing over her. You were nothing but a dumb, spoiled pawn to get me direct access to your father's credit line. You were an easy target. Now stay out of my way. He turned and left her sobbing on the floor. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, echoing through the massive empty house. Chloe lay there on the cold hardwood, listening to the aggressive roar of his sports car engine as he sped out of the driveway. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was tangled and her expensive makeup was completely ruined by her tears. Anyone else would have recognized the absolute finality in Bradley's voice. Anyone else would have heard his cruel words and realized they had been completely played for a fool. But Chloe was not like anyone else. She had been shielded from harsh realities her entire life. Her brain simply could not process the fact that she was a victim. As she slowly pushed herself off the floor, her twisted logic began to rewrite the entire narrative. Bradley was not a monster who used her. He was just terrified. He was a good man who made a desperate mistake to provide for their future, and now the federal government was hunting him. He pushed her away because he wanted to protect her from the fallout. He grabbed his passport because he was running away to Europe to start a new life for them. She convinced herself that if she could just find him and bring him enough cash, they could disappear together and be happy. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She needed money immediately. Her credit cards were entirely useless, and her parents were practically bankrupt trying to cover the massive federal bail. There was only one person left in the entire family who had actual liquid capital: Maya. Chloe did not feel a single ounce of guilt about what she was about to do. She did not plan to apologize for the years of horrific bullying or the slap-in-the-glass conference room. In her mind, I was still her subordinate, and I owed her whatever she demanded. Chloe ran out to her Range Rover and drove recklessly through the empty Atlanta streets toward my downtown luxury high-rise. She ignored every red light, completely consumed by her frantic mission. It was nearly 3 in the morning when she bypassed the front desk's security by slipping in behind a late-night food delivery driver. She rode the elevator up to my penthouse floor, her foot tapping anxiously against the metal wall. When the doors opened, she marched directly down the quiet carpeted hallway and began pounding her fists aggressively against my heavy front door. She did not ring the bell. She just kept banging her hands against the wood, screaming my name into the silent corridor. Inside my apartment, I was already awake. I had been reviewing the final forensic reports for the federal prosecutor when my security system alerted me to her presence. I watched her unhinged behavior on my tablet for a few moments before walking to the foyer. I pulled the door open, standing perfectly still in my silk pajamas. Chloe looked like an absolute disaster. Her clothes were wrinkled, her knees were bruised, and her eyes were wild with manic desperation. Before I could even ask why she was terrorizing my hallway, she shoved her way past me and walked straight into my living room. She paced across my expensive rug, leaving dirty footprints behind. She did not care about the physical mess she was making or the fact that she was trespassing. Her entire existence was wrapped up in saving a man who had completely and utterly destroyed her family. I need $50,000 in cash right now, she demanded, her voice hoarse and commanding. I know you have it, Maya. Do not play games with me. My husband is in serious trouble and he had to leave the country. I need the money to book a private charter and track him down before the feds completely freeze the borders. I slowly closed my front door and turned to look at my older sister. I did not feel pity. I felt absolute pure disgust. You broke into my secure building in the middle of the night to demand $50,000, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. Yes, she snapped, crossing her arms as if she were the one in charge. Bradley is just scared, Maya. You backed him into a corner with your stupid investigation and he panicked. He said those horrible things to me because he wanted to protect me from being implicated. He is probably on his way to Europe right now, waiting for me to join him. We are going to start over. I just need the cash. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer depth of her delusion. He literally stole your entire life savings and admitted he never loved you, and your first instinct is to chase him, I said, shaking my head. You really are a pathetic, spoiled child. How can you be this blind, Chloe? He does not want to protect you. He used you to drain Dad's accounts, and now he is discarding you because you have absolutely no value left. She lunged forward, her face turning red with fury. "Shut up!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You know nothing about my marriage. He loves me. He has always loved me. You are just trying to poison my mind because you want me to be as miserable and alone as you are. Give me the money, Maya." I looked at her completely empty, desperate eyes. She was clinging to a fantasy because the reality would absolutely destroy her. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I held it out toward her. She looked at it confused. "He is not going to Europe, Chloe," I said, my voice ice cold. "And he is not going alone. Watch this and see what your husband really thinks of you." Chloe snatched the heavy silver flash drive from my hand without saying a single word to me. She practically ran down the long carpeted hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of my quiet apartment. I watched her hit the elevator button over and over again. When the doors opened, she rushed inside. I locked my door and walked back to my bedroom. I had watched that security footage dozens of times, compiling evidence for the federal prosecutor. I knew the exact timestamp where Bradley's charming facade melted away, revealing the absolute monster underneath. Chloe sat in her Range Rover parked in the alleyway behind my building. Her hands shook violently as she pulled her silver laptop from the console. She booted up the computer, breathing heavily. She kept telling herself I was lying, whispering to the empty car that I was just a bitter, jealous sister trying to destroy her marriage. She plugged the flash drive into the laptop. A single video file appeared on the screen labeled Downtown Condo. She hesitated before double-clicking the file. The media player opened, revealing high-definition security camera footage. The camera angle was positioned near the ceiling of a modern living room overlooking a white leather sofa and a glass coffee table. Chloe recognized the expensive furniture Bradley had tried to buy for their own home. The timestamp indicated the recording was from a Tuesday afternoon, just 3 weeks ago. Chloe had been at a country club luncheon that day. The video played in total silence before the audio suddenly kicked in. The front door opened, and Bradley walked into the frame. He wore his expensive tailored suit, but his tie was loosened, and he was laughing. A tall, stunningly beautiful white woman walked in right behind him, carrying a shopping bag from an exclusive boutique. Bradley wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her passionately. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hand over her mouth. The woman giggled and sat down, handing Bradley a glass of wine. "You really need to spend more time here," the woman said, taking a sip of her wine. "I am getting so bored sitting in this gorgeous apartment all by myself while you play house in Buckhead." Bradley laughed, his arrogant chuckle echoing through the laptop speakers. "I know, baby," he replied, resting his hand on her thigh. "We are almost at the finish line. The offshore accounts are fully funded, and the old man is clueless. I just need to endure a few more family dinners and I will be free." The woman smiled, running her fingers through his hair. "And what about your gorgeous wife?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is she going to be heartbroken when her perfect night disappears into the sunset?" Bradley laughed loudly. "Chloe," he said, shaking his head in amusement. "She is nothing but a naive little diversity project. Her family is so obsessed with status and having a white son-in-law, they practically handed me the keys to their bank accounts. She is completely clueless. She spends her days swiping credit cards, pretending she is royalty, while I drain every dime from her trust fund. I do not even sleep in the same room with her, unless I absolutely have to keep up the charade." The video continued to play, but Chloe could not hear anything else. Thick, hot tears filled her eyes. Her entire world completely shattered. For her entire life, she had believed she was superior to me. She believed her lighter skin and her perfect marriage made her the ultimate golden child. But the truth was devastating. Her entire existence was a humiliating lie, She was not a queen. She was an easy, gullible target used by a manipulative predator to steal her family wealth. She slammed the laptop shut and let out an agonizing scream that echoed in the dark car. She sobbed, gripping the steering wheel. 5 days passed. It was New Year's Eve. The atmosphere inside the Buckhead mansion was completely toxic. The federal investigation escalated and bank accounts remained frozen. Despite the absolute destruction of their lives, Marcus and Helen flatly refused to cancel their attendance at the annual New Year's Eve church gala. Skipping the prestigious social event would be an admission of defeat. They needed to show the elite community of Atlanta that they were still wealthy, untouchable, and proud. Helen barged into Chloe's dark bedroom. Chloe had not showered or eaten in days. She was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the footage. Helen yanked the curtains open, letting harsh sunlight flood the room. "Get up," Helen commanded, tossing a black evening gown onto the bed. "You are going to take a shower, put on makeup, and act like everything is perfectly fine. We have to keep up appearances. We cannot let people think we are ruined." Chloe slowly sat up, her eyes extremely swollen and red from endless crying. "Mom, I absolutely cannot go," she whispered, her voice cracking with pain. "Bradley is gone forever. He took everything we had." Helen violently grabbed her daughter by the shoulders. "Bradley is just on a short business trip," Helen lied, clinging to the absolute delusion. "You will put on that dress and smile. Do not embarrass this family tonight." Chloe numbly obeyed. She let her mother drag her into the luxurious marble bathroom. She put on heavy dark makeup to hide her deeply swollen circles and squeezed into the restrictive black designer gown. She followed her parents out to the luxury car like a completely lifeless puppet. The silent car ride was absolutely and utterly suffocating. What none of them knew was that Bradley had not secretly left the country yet. He was confidently scheduled to be the honorable keynote speaker at the massive gala that very night to maintain his innocent public cover before his final midnight flight. The stage was finally set for the ultimate explosive collision. The massive ballroom of the church was heavily decorated with cascading white floral arrangements and thousands of glowing fairy lights. The annual New Year's Eve gala was the absolute pinnacle of social events for the Black elite of Atlanta. Mayors, judges, and high-powered executives filled the tables wearing tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. But tonight, the extravagant decorations could not hide the incredibly tense atmosphere. When Marcus and Helen walked into the grand ballroom with Chloe, the ambient chatter dropped to a hushed murmur. Every single pair of eyes in the room darted toward my parents. The news of the FBI raid had dominated the local news cycles all week. The wealthy patrons whispered behind their champagne flutes. Marcus tried to maintain his usual arrogant posture, but his smile was painfully forced. Helen gripped his arm tightly, pretending not to notice the blatant stares. They were focused on surviving the night and salvaging their destroyed social standing. They were desperately waiting for Bradley to save them. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone and commanded the attention of the crowd. He introduced the speaker, praising him as a brilliant financial mind. The crowd offered a strained applause as Bradley confidently walked onto the stage. He looked absolutely flawless. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His bright blue eyes scanned the massive room with complete predatory arrogance. He stepped up to the crystal podium and adjusted the microphone. He did not look like a man who was planning to flee the country in less than 3 hours. He looked like a triumphant king holding court. Bradley began his speech with a warm, charismatic smile. He spoke smoothly about faith and the unbreakable bonds of family. He had the absolute audacity to deliver a deeply hypocritical sermon about weathering storms together. He looked directly at my parents' table and offered them a sickeningly sweet smile. He told the audience that real family members never abandon each other when things get difficult. He was masterfully manipulating the entire congregation, using his speech as a flawless public alibi. He wanted everyone to remember him as the loyal son-in-law right up until the exact moment he vanished. Marcus nodded along with the speech, his eyes shining with desperate gratitude. He was so terrified of losing his wealth that he swallowed every single lie Bradley told. Helen actually dabbed a tear from her cheek, completely taken in by his performance. She looked around, hoping the elite guests were buying this display of family unity. But Chloe sat perfectly rigid in her chair. She stared up at the man on the stage. Her hands gripped the edges of the white tablecloth so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She listened to him preach, while the disgusting words he had spoken to his mistress echoed in her mind. Naive little diversity project. Those words burned in her brain like battery acid. She was vibrating with a terrifying repressed rage, just waiting for a spark. Her perfect marriage was a calculated financial transaction, and her loving husband was a vicious parasite preparing to leave her bankrupt. That spark arrived precisely halfway through Bradley's speech. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly swung wide open. The loud thud of the doors hitting the walls echoed sharply, cutting right through the sound of the microphone. The entire congregation turned around in their seats to see what had caused the disruption. I stood perfectly framed in the grand entryway. I did not wear a cheap department store dress or my usual conservative business suit. I wore a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown that cascaded gracefully to the floor. An intricate diamond necklace rested against my collarbone, catching the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. I radiated a cold, untouchable, and completely silent wealth. The kind of wealth that did not need to be announced or bragged about. The room fell entirely dead silent. The whispered gossip instantly ceased. For my entire life, I had been the forgotten daughter, the embarrassing, dark-skinned secret kept hidden in the background. Tonight, I was the only person commanding the room. I stepped onto the plush carpet and began walking slowly down the center aisle. The crowd instinctively parted for me. I felt the shocked stares of my parents' wealthy friends, but I ignored them all. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. Up on the stage, Bradley's smooth, charismatic voice suddenly faltered. He stopped mid-sentence. His hands gripped the sides of the crystal podium as a flash of genuine panic finally broke through his arrogant mask. He recognized the look in my eyes. He knew his perfect exit strategy was rapidly unraveling. He tried to recover his composure, clearing his throat and leaning back into the microphone, but the damage was already done. The absolute silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. I did not walk all the way to the front. I stopped exactly halfway down the center aisle, standing perfectly still amidst the sea of seated guests. I slowly turned my head and looked toward my family table. Marcus and Helen were staring at me with their mouths hanging open, completely paralyzed by shock and fear. They could not understand how the daughter they had violently discarded was now standing before them, looking like absolute royalty. But I did not look at them. I locked eyes directly with my sister. Chloe was already looking right back at me. Her chest was heaving and her eyes were wild with absolute devastation and fury. She was a loaded weapon, completely stripped of her pride and pushed entirely to the brink of insanity. She just needed someone to pull the trigger. I held her gaze for one long, heavy second. I did not say a single word. I simply gave her one single sharp nod. It was the unspoken permission she needed to finally attack. Chloe stood up so incredibly fast that her heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed very loudly against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. She did not hesitate for even a single passing second. She aggressively hiked up the heavy, expensive fabric of her black designer gown and began marching directly toward the elevated stage. Her pace accelerated with every step, transforming from a determined walk into an aggressive, furious sprint. High up on the crystal podium, Bradley watched his furious wife charging toward him. His charming smile faltered, but he desperately tried to maintain his public composure. He leaned into the microphone, letting out a nervous, forced chuckle. "It looks like my beautiful wife is eager to come up here and join me," he said, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. But Chloe did not use the carpeted stairs on the side of the stage. She placed both hands on the edge of the platform and vaulted herself up with a terrifying manic strength. Before Bradley could even step back or raise his hands to defend himself, Chloe launched her entire body weight directly at him. She tackled him right around his waist. The heavy crystal podium tipped backward and completely shattered against the hardwood stage. The microphone hit the ground, producing a deafening high-pitched squeal of audio feedback that made all 500 guests cover their ears in pain. Bradley hit the floor hard, flat on his back, with Chloe pinning him down. She raised her fists and began striking him wildly, her heavy diamond rings tearing across his cheek and his lip. "You filthy lying parasite!" she screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a raw, agonizing shriek. "You told her I was just a naive little diversity project. You drained my accounts. You stole $4 million from my father." She grabbed the collar of his expensive midnight blue tuxedo and shook him violently. "Tell them," Chloe yelled, gesturing wildly toward the shocked congregation. "Tell all these people how you funneled our family legacy into offshore accounts so you could run away to Europe with your blonde mistress tonight." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaotic pandemonium. 500 pillars of the Atlanta elite gasped in unison. Women covered their mouths in horror, while several men frantically pulled out their smartphones to record the unbelievable spectacle. The flawless, untouchable image of our wealthy family was being violently and publicly shredded right in front of their eyes. Marcus jumped up from his table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He rushed toward the stage, desperate to stop his daughter from exposing their catastrophic financial ruin to the entire city. "Chloe, stop it right now," Marcus commanded, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He reached the edge of the stage, but he never made it up the stairs. The overwhelming stress, the sheer public humiliation, and the terrifying reality of his impending bankruptcy finally caught up with his body. Marcus suddenly stopped, clutching his chest with both hands. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed heavily onto the marble floor, suffering from a massive panic attack. Helen let out an ear-piercing wail of pure terror. She dropped to her knees beside her gasping husband, her expensive silk gown pooling around her on the dirty floor. She forgot all about her perfect posture and her high society etiquette. She was reduced to a hysterical, sobbing mess, begging the surrounding guests to call for an ambulance. But the wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress simply backed away from her, whispering fiercely among themselves and completely ignoring her desperate pleas for help. They looked at my family with absolute disgust. I stood perfectly still in the center aisle, watching the beautiful carnage unfold. I did not intervene. I did not offer any comfort. I simply watched the toxic empire they had built on lies completely burn to the ground. Two large church security guards finally snapped out of their shock and rushed the stage. They grabbed Chloe by her arms and forcefully hauled her off her husband. She kicked and screamed, fighting them like a wild animal still trying to reach Bradley. "Let me go!" she shrieked, her makeup completely smeared across her face, making her look deranged. "He is a thief. He is leaving the country tonight." Bradley slowly pushed himself off the floor, wiping a stream of dark blood from his split lip. His expensive tuxedo was ripped and covered in dust. He looked out at the horrified crowd and desperately tried to salvage his ruined exit strategy. "She is having a severe mental breakdown," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at his hysterical wife. "She is completely delusional. Someone call a doctor." But absolutely nobody in the massive room called a doctor. As Bradley stood there trying to spin his final pathetic lie, the heavy side doors of the ballroom suddenly burst open. 4 federal agents wearing dark suits marched aggressively into the room. I had called Special Agent Thomas exactly 1 hour before the gala began, providing him with Bradley's confirmed flight itinerary and the exact address of the church. The agents ignored Marcus writhing on the floor and Helen screaming. They bypassed my parents entirely and marched straight up the wooden stairs onto the stage. Bradley froze in absolute terror as the federal agents surrounded him. He knew his perfect scam was finally over. The lead agent grabbed Bradley's arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and snapped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and attempting to flee the country," the agent announced loudly. Bradley did not fight back. His shoulders slumped, and his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He hung his head in absolute defeat as the agents marched him aggressively off the stage, leaving the golden child sobbing uncontrollably on the floor behind him. He hung his head in absolute defeat as the agents marched him aggressively off the stage, leaving the golden child sobbing uncontrollably on the floor behind him. The dust finally settled over the absolute wreckage of my family, exactly 2 weeks into the new year. The glamorous holiday decorations were packed away, and the bitter chill of January gripped the city of Atlanta. I found myself sitting comfortably inside a sterile, brightly lit deposition room on the 14th floor of the federal courthouse. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit and sipped black coffee from a styrofoam cup. The room was packed with people who held the remaining fragments of my father's crumbling empire. Special Agent Thomas sat to my right, reviewing a thick stack of printed emails and bank statements. Across the heavy wooden table sat the extremely expensive and highly stressed defense attorneys representing both Marcus and Bradley. My father and my brother-in-law were not in the room. They were currently sitting in separate holding cells, completely stripped of their designer suits and their arrogant pride, waiting to learn their ultimate fate. The defense attorneys looked absolutely exhausted. They had spent the last 14 days frantically trying to build a viable defense strategy, but they were essentially trying to construct a house out of ash. One of Bradley's high-priced lawyers leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the scratched wooden table. He desperately tried to project an aura of intimidating legal authority, but his voice lacked any real conviction. He looked directly at me and cleared his throat. "My client insists that you were a fully willing participant in this financial maneuver, Maya," he said nervously, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "He claims that you willingly signed those massive commercial loan documents to secure vital capital for the struggling family business and that you only contacted the federal authorities because of a petty personal family dispute. He actually thinks he can drag you down with him by tying you directly to the forged signatures." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee before setting the cup down on the table. I looked at the lawyer with a perfectly calm expression. I did not need to raise my voice or show any emotion whatsoever. I simply let the undeniable facts speak for themselves. "Your client is a desperate liar and a remarkably sloppy criminal," I replied smoothly. "I did not just stumble upon a few missing bank statements and make an angry phone call to the local police department. I am a certified forensic accountant with over a decade of high-level corporate experience. I spent 6 entire months quietly building an ironclad federal case against him. I handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a completely wrapped package. I gave them the offshore routing numbers, the fake shell corporation registries hidden in the Cayman Islands, and the exact internet protocol addresses your client used when he forged my signature from his downtown condominium." Special Agent Thomas nodded his head in agreement, completely validating my statement to the room. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward the panicked defense attorneys. "That is a signed federal immunity agreement," Thomas stated firmly, looking the men dead in the eyes. "Maya approached the Internal Revenue Service long before any of you even knew there was an active criminal investigation. She legally utilized the federal whistleblower program. Because she provided undeniable concrete proof of massive offshore tax evasion and corporate fraud, the federal government has officially granted her full absolute immunity regarding the forged loan documents. She is completely untouchable by your clients or this court." The defense attorneys stared down at the official government seal on the paper, their faces turning completely pale. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed down on them all at once. They finally understood that I was never the helpless victim in this scenario. I was the silent, calculating architect of their absolute ruin. I had allowed Bradley to think he was a financial genius right up until the exact moment I shut the steel trap on his neck. He honestly thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against a naive rich family, but I owned the entire board from the very beginning. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the legal documents. Bradley is facing up to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. I said, my voice steady and ice cold. And my father is going to lose absolutely everything he owns trying to pay back the bank and the massive federal fines. They dug their own graves. I simply provided the shovels. The lead defense attorney representing my father wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of deep resentment and genuine fear. "You completely destroyed your own family," he muttered, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "You purposefully burned down your father's entire lifelong legacy just to prove a point to them. You walk away with your freedom, but you are leaving them to rot with absolutely nothing." I smiled, a genuine cold smile that actually reached my eyes. "Oh, I am walking away with a lot more than just my freedom," I replied, leaning back comfortably in my chair. The lawyers looked incredibly confused, exchanging quick, nervous glances across the table. I decided to educate these expensive men on the specific finer points of federal tax law. Under the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower program, when an informant provides actionable intelligence that leads directly to the successful recovery of massive tax fraud, that informant does not just get a simple pat on the back. The law strictly dictates that the official whistleblower is legally entitled to receive anywhere from 15 to 30% of the total recovered funds. Bradley stole $4 million, and he evaded millions more in corporate taxes over the past 5 years. The federal government is going to seize absolutely all of it, and when they finally liquidate those hidden accounts, they're going to cut me a massive multi-million-dollar check for turning him in. The deposition room went completely dead silent, as the lawyers realized I was not just walking away free and clear. I was walking away incredibly rich, directly profiting from the very crime they tried so desperately to pin on me. I was walking away incredibly rich, directly profiting from the very crime they tried so desperately to pin on me. The weeks that followed that deposition were an absolute masterclass in total financial destruction. They completely liquidated his commercial real estate portfolio. Every single property he had spent decades acquiring was auctioned off to satisfy massive debts and federal fines. The family business ceased to exist entirely. The corporate headquarters downtown was cleared out, and the gold letters spelling our family name were ripped off the glass lobby wall. Bradley did not fare any better. Once his expensive lawyers realized I possessed the offshore routing numbers tying him to the Cayman Island accounts, they abandoned his defense. They advised him to take a plea deal. The arrogant white savior who mocked my sister stood before a federal judge wearing an orange jumpsuit. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. The judge showed zero mercy, sentencing him to 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. There was no country club prison waiting. He was going to spend his best years locked in a concrete cell, stripped of his entire superiority. He had lost everything he ever truly cared about in life. Meanwhile, the reality of severe poverty crashed down on my parents and sister with brutal force. The bank seized all of their assets, including luxury vehicles, jewelry, and investment portfolios. They were left with nothing but the massive Buckhead mansion, and even that was heavily leveraged. By the second week of February, the utility companies finally lost patience. Because the accounts were drained, Marcus and Helen could not pay the heating bills required to maintain a 20,000-square-foot estate. The power grid was shut off. The mansion transformed into a freezing dark tomb. Marcus had suffered another cardiac event from the stress and was recovering in a state-funded medical facility because his premium health insurance had been canceled. That left Helen and Chloe alone in the freezing house. They spent their days wrapped in heavy coats, huddling together in the dark living room, staring blankly at the cold stone fireplace. The chandeliers were dead. They ate cold, canned soup, terrified of answering the constant knocks of debt collectors at the front door. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, a banging echoed through the empty foyer. Chloe flinched, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Helen slowly stood up, her bones aching from the freezing temperature inside the house. She shuffled through the dark hallway, her breath visible in the air. She did not open the heavy oak door. She peeked through the narrow side window, expecting to see another process server. But there was nobody standing on the frozen front porch. There was only a green piece of paper stapled directly to the expensive custom woodwork of their front door. Helen slowly opened the door and pulled the green paper free. Her hands shook violently as she read the bold black letters printed across the top. It was an official county foreclosure and eviction notice. The bank had officially reclaimed the property. The bottom of the notice clearly stated that they had exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the premises before armed county sheriffs would arrive to forcibly remove them and change all the locks. Helen stared at the paper, her mind completely shattering. This house was the absolute center of her identity. It was her ultimate status symbol, her proof that she was better than everyone else in her elite social circle. And now, she was being thrown out onto the street like a common criminal. Panic completely consumed her. She ran back into the freezing living room, waving the green paper at Chloe. "We have to leave," Helen sobbed hysterically, tears streaming down her freezing face. "They are taking the house, Chloe. They are throwing us out on Thursday morning. We have nowhere to go." Chloe just sat there staring blankly at the dead fireplace, completely catatonic. She had nothing left to give. Her husband was in prison, her trust fund was gone, and her golden child status was entirely worthless in the real world. Helen realized she had absolutely zero options left. Her wealthy country club friends had completely blacklisted her the moment the FBI raided the family business. Nobody was going to offer them a warm guest house or a financial loan. She pulled her dead cell phone from her pocket and frantically plugged it into a portable battery pack she had found in Marcus' desk. She waited agonizing minutes for the screen to illuminate. When it finally powered on, she opened her contacts. She stared at my name for a long time. The daughter she had violently slapped, the daughter she had called worthless and aggressively kicked out of this very house on Christmas Day. Helen swallowed her massive, suffocating pride. She pressed the call button and raised the phone to her ear, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The phone rang 3 times before going to my automated voicemail. Helen broke down completely. "Maya," she choked out, her voice pathetic and weak. "Please pick up. The bank is taking the house. They are throwing us out in the freezing cold. We have absolutely no money, and your father is in the hospital. Please, Maya, I know I said horrible things to you, but you are my daughter. Please help us. I am begging you." I was sitting in my warm, brightly lit penthouse apartment, reviewing the final paperwork for my massive IRS whistleblower payout, when my phone screen illuminated silently on my glass desk. A notification popped up indicating a new voicemail from a blocked number. I tapped the screen and saw the transcript generating. I saw the words begging and freezing and help us. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering family loyalty. I simply swiped my finger firmly to the left and hit the delete button, erasing her voice forever, without even listening to a single second of her pathetic apology. I simply swiped my finger firmly to the left and hit the delete button, erasing her voice forever, without even listening to a single second of her pathetic apology. 2 days later, the county courthouse was buzzing with local real estate investors and opportunistic buyers looking for heavily discounted properties. The massive granite building felt entirely different to me today. It was a Thursday morning, and the bitter winter frost still clung to the high windows of the grand public auction hall. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors wearing a tailored black wool coat and large dark sunglasses that completely concealed my eyes. I did not want to be recognized by any of the predatory local developers who used to do business with my arrogant father. I found a quiet, empty seat in the very back row of the crowded room. I crossed my legs, holding a sleek black leather portfolio tightly in my lap. Inside that portfolio was a certified bank draft. The massive IRS whistleblower reward had successfully cleared my accounts the previous afternoon. The sheer amount of liquid cash I now possessed was truly staggering. I sat silently listening to the auctioneer speak. The auctioneer was a loud, fast-talking man who moved quickly through a long list of completely ruined commercial buildings and neglected residential lots. The crowd was full of hungry sharks trying to steal a cheap bargain. I watched them aggressively outbid each other over insignificant pieces of dirt. I did not raise my paddle for any of those initial offerings. I was waiting for one specific item on the extensive docket. After nearly an hour of tedious bidding, the large digital screen behind the podium finally flashed a highly familiar picture. It was a wide aerial photograph of the massive Buckhead mansion, my childhood home, the house where I was completely ignored and treated like an invisible ghost for 33 miserable years. The auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the property, noting its massive square footage and its highly prestigious location. He also loudly noted the extensive federal liens and the terrible structural neglect it had recently suffered. Because the bank was completely desperate to recover their lost capital immediately, they set the initial starting bid ridiculously low. It was literally pennies on the dollar compared to its actual market value. The room suddenly grew very quiet. The local developers hesitated. They knew the property was incredibly toxic right now because of my father's highly publicized federal arrest. Nobody wanted to be directly associated with that kind of massive high society scandal. The auctioneer called out the incredibly low starting price, asking for any opening bids. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The silence was thick and heavy. Finally, a man sitting in the front row lazily raised his numbered paddle, offering the absolute minimum acceptable bid. He clearly thought he was going to easily steal the mansion without any real competition. The auctioneer enthusiastically accepted the opening bid and asked for any other challengers. I slowly raised my hand, holding my paddle high in the air. I doubled his bid instantly. The man in the front row turned his head completely around to look at me. He could not see my eyes behind the dark sunglasses, but he could definitely feel my cold, absolute resolve. He scowled and raised his paddle again, adding another $50,000 to the current total. I did not even blink. I immediately raised my paddle again and aggressively added another $500,000 to the pot. A loud collective gasp echoed through the crowded auction hall. The man in the front row immediately dropped his paddle, shaking his head in total defeat. He realized he was fighting a completely unwinnable battle against someone with unlimited liquid resources. The auctioneer looked directly at me, his eyes wide with genuine surprise. He loudly called out my massive bid, scanning the quiet room for any other brave challengers. Going once, he yelled, his voice echoing off the high granite walls. Going twice, he shouted, pointing his heavy wooden gavel directly toward the back row. Sold, he finally roared, slamming the heavy gavel down onto the wooden podium with a loud, satisfying crack. The echo of that strike sounded like absolute pure justice to my ears. I had just legally purchased the multi-million-dollar estate for a fraction of its former glory, paying entirely in clean federal cash. The house that had violently rejected me my entire life now officially belonged to me. The auctioneer pointed toward the side door, instructing me to meet the county clerk to finalize the heavy legal paperwork and immediately transfer the required funds. I stood up, smoothing my tailored coat. I walked confidently down the center aisle, ignoring the curious stares of the defeated investors. I entered the small private administrative office adjacent to the main auction floor. The county clerk was a tired-looking woman, sitting behind a messy desk, completely covered in incredibly thick property files. She handed me a heavy stack of official transfer documents and politely asked for my certified bank draft. I slowly unzipped my sleek leather portfolio and handed over the massive check. Her tired eyes went completely wide with absolute shock when she finally saw the incredibly large sum printed neatly on the crisp paper. She quickly verified the federal funds and began frantically typing the required information into her outdated computer system. She looked up at me while holding a blue pen hovering over the final formal deed of ownership. She asked me what specific corporate entity or joint family trust she should legally list as the primary permanent owner of the sprawling estate. I reached up and slowly pulled the large dark sunglasses completely off my face. I looked the confused clerk directly in her eyes and gave her a very warm, incredibly satisfied smile. Put it entirely in my name, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Solo. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a profound sense of closure that no amount of money could ever buy. The paper in my hand was not just a property deed, it was the physical manifestation of my ultimate victory over the people who had tried to break my spirit. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter, freezing wind that swept through the empty streets of Buckhead. At exactly 8 o'clock sharp, 2 armed county sheriffs arrived at the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. They did not knock politely or wait for an invitation. They bypassed the security system and pounded heavily on the front door, executing the formal eviction order. Inside the freezing mansion, Marcus, Helen, and Chloe were forced to hastily abandon their lifelong sanctuary. Because the bank had seized their luxury vehicles and frozen their accounts, they had absolutely no way to transport the few personal belongings they were legally allowed to keep. They were reduced to dragging cheap plastic suitcases and garbage bags filled with wrinkled clothes down the incredibly long sweeping driveway. The sheer humiliation of the moment was entirely lost on them, because they were too busy viciously tearing each other completely apart. The toxic dynamic that had held their fake family together had completely imploded. Marcus shuffled down the driveway, clutching his chest and wheezing. He loudly blamed Helen for their current absolute ruin, screaming that her endless obsession with country club status and expensive jewelry had blinded them to Bradley's massive financial theft. Helen walked a few paces behind him, her face red with furious indignation. She screamed right back at Marcus, calling him a pathetic, weak old man who had allowed a young white con artist to steal his entire legacy right out from under his nose. She angrily yelled that she should have completely divorced him decades ago. Chloe aggressively dragged a completely broken plastic suitcase behind her back, sobbing hysterically, not because her father was ill or her mother was having a breakdown, but because the sharp gravel of the driveway was completely ruining the bottoms of her incredibly expensive designer shoes. They were truly a pathetic broken trio, marching sadly toward a very miserable, lonely future. They had barely managed to secure a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a heavily run-down, dangerous neighborhood located on the absolute farthest outer outskirts of the massive, dirty city. It was a terrifying reality for 3 people who had never washed their own dishes or paid a single utility bill in their entire lives. They bickered endlessly about who would have to sleep on the cheap sofa and how they would possibly survive without a private chef or a weekly housekeeper. The toxicity was completely eating itself, feeding on the absolute misery of their situation. The wealthy, judgmental neighbors they had spent years looking down upon were now peering out from behind their velvet curtains, secretly watching the mighty family being unceremoniously thrown out onto the street. The sheriff deputies stood near the front porch, watching them struggle down the long driveway with absolutely zero human sympathy or basic compassion. They were standing exactly halfway down the massive driveway when the low, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine cut through the bitter morning air. A sleek, jet-black Porsche Panamera turned sharply off the main street and began gliding smoothly up the driveway, heading directly toward them. The expensive tires crunched loudly against the gravel. Marcus, Helen, and Chloe immediately stopped dragging their heavy bags. For a brief, fleeting moment, their deeply ingrained delusions flared back to life. Helen frantically wiped the tears and smeared makeup from her face, desperately trying to compose herself. She whispered loudly to Marcus that it must be one of their wealthy friends from the church congregation finally arriving to rescue them from this terrible misunderstanding. Chloe eagerly stepped forward, completely forgetting about her ruined shoes, hoping that maybe Bradley had magically returned to save her with a car full of stolen cash. They stood there shivering in the cold, waiting for their glorious salvation to arrive. The black Porsche did not speed up or honk its horn. It simply rolled to a slow, calculated stop, completely blocking the entire width of the driveway. They could not walk around it without stepping into the freezing wet grass. The dark-tinted driver's side window slowly rolled down, revealing nothing but shadows inside the luxurious cabin. The family held their breath, staring intently at the sleek vehicle. Then the heavy driver's side door smoothly swung open. A pair of expensive black leather boots stepped out onto the gravel. I stood up slowly, stepping out of the warm, luxurious interior of my vehicle into the freezing winter air. I wore the same tailored black wool coat from the auction. I did not look angry or vengeful. I looked completely at peace. The arrogant, hopeful expressions on my parents' faces completely vanished the very second they recognized me. Helen's jaw literally dropped open, and Marcus took a sudden, unsteady step backward, completely stunned by my sudden appearance. They stared at my expensive car and my designer clothes, utterly unable to comprehend how the daughter they had violently discarded was now sitting behind the wheel of a luxury sports car. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, her eyes darting frantically between me and the Porsche. The shock of my arrival practically paralyzed them. They stood completely frozen in the middle of the cold driveway, unable to speak a single word. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the crisp green document the county clerk had given me. I held the crisp official property deed high up in the freezing winter air, letting the morning sunlight catch the gold municipal seal stamped on the bottom. The message was absolutely undeniable. I was definitely not there to rescue them from their nightmare. I was the absolute new owner of this entire massive estate. The wind seemed to completely stop as the three of them stared at the bright green paper fluttering slightly in my hand. Marcus adjusted his glasses, his trembling fingers pushing the wire frames up the bridge of his nose to get a better look at the official county seal. The name printed boldly at the bottom of the property deed was mine, and mine alone. For a few agonizing seconds, the reality of the situation fought a violent war against his deeply ingrained arrogance. His brain simply refused to accept that the daughter he had treated like an absolute peasant had just legally purchased his multi-million-dollar kingdom entirely in cash. But as he looked from the official deed to my expensive tailored coat and the luxury sports car idling behind me, the last remaining wall of his massive ego finally crumbled. Marcus suddenly took a step forward, dropping the handle of his cheap plastic suitcase. He completely changed his physical posture, desperately trying to summon the ghost of his former patriarchal authority. He forced a wide, trembling smile onto his pale face. He actually believed he could simply flip a switch and manipulate me into handing everything over to him. He walked toward me, holding his arms out, as if he were preparing to embrace a prodigal daughter returning home from a long journey. "Maya, thank God," he said, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of fake affection and pathetic begging. "I knew you would not let us down. You bought the house back for the family. You used your accounting connections to save our legacy. We can put all this ugly business behind us now. We can move back inside and start over completely fresh." He reached out his hand, attempting to touch my shoulder. I took one smooth, deliberate step backward, putting a safe distance between us. I did not let his hand make contact with my expensive wool coat. I looked at the pathetic, broken man standing in front of me, and I laughed. It was not a bitter laugh or an angry scoff. It was a cold, genuine laugh of absolute pure amusement. The sound echoed across the frozen gravel driveway, cutting through the bitter morning air like a sharpened blade. He stopped reaching for me, his fake smile instantly vanishing. "I did not buy it for the family, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "I bought it for the land." He blinked, staring at me in total confusion. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, looking back at the massive brick mansion. "It is a historic estate. It is our home." "Not anymore," I replied, slipping the deed back into my coat pocket. "This house is nothing but a decaying monument to your massive ego and your completely toxic lies. It is infested with decades of abuse and financial fraud. I have absolutely no intention of living in it. I have already hired a commercial demolition crew. I am having it completely bulldozed next month to clear the 5 acres of land. I am going to build a highly profitable complex of modern luxury townhomes right over the exact spot where your precious dining room currently sits. The words hit them with the physical force of a freight train. The idea that someone would intentionally destroy their sacred high society sanctuary was completely unfathomable to them. Helen let out a sudden, agonizing shriek. The absolute finality of my statement completely shattered her mind. The house was her entire identity. It was the only thing she had left to cling to in her ruined, pathetic life. She lunged forward, her hands curling into tight fists, her face contorting into a mask of pure, visceral hatred. She completely abandoned any lingering pretense of being a dignified, wealthy matriarch. "You are a complete monster!" Helen screamed, her voice tearing violently from her throat. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a disgusting, unnatural monster! How could you possibly do this to your own flesh and blood? You are standing there gloating while we are thrown out into the freezing cold with absolutely nothing. You have no soul, Maya. You have absolutely no heart." She stood there, chest heaving, panting like a cornered wild animal, waiting for me to show a single ounce of guilt or remorse. She desperately wanted me to break down and apologize for finally defending myself. She wanted me to feel the shame she had projected onto me for 33 years. I looked at her, completely unbothered by her hysterical screaming. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman who gave birth to me. The maternal bond had been completely severed the night she told me I contributed nothing to her life. I tilted my head slightly and looked her dead in the eyes. "I learned from the best, Helen," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I spent my entire life trying to earn a single scrap of your affection. I played the obedient, quiet background character while you paraded Chloe and her thief of a husband around like royalty. You stood in that grand dining room on Christmas Day and looked me directly in the eyes. You laughed at me. You told me my value to this family was exactly zero. You told me I was completely worthless." I took one step closer to her, completely invading her space. Helen flinched, shrinking back from the intense cold fire in my eyes. "I just proved you wrong," I stated firmly. "My value is a multi-million-dollar real estate acquisition paid entirely in cash. Your value is currently a broken suitcase sitting in a frozen driveway." Helen opened her mouth to argue, but absolutely no words came out. She was completely silenced by the undeniable, crushing truth. She looked down at the freezing gravel, completely defeated. I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at the 2 armed county sheriffs standing silently near the front porch. They had watched the entire confrontation unfold with absolute professional detachment. "Officers," I called out, projecting my voice clearly across the large driveway. "These 3 individuals are officially trespassing on my private property. I want them completely removed from the premises immediately." The taller sheriff nodded firmly, resting his hand on his utility belt. He immediately began walking down the driveway toward my parents. "You heard the property owner," he announced, his voice loud and authoritative. "Your eviction window is officially closed. Grab your bags and move off the property line right now, or you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Marcus, Helen, and Chloe scrambled backward, terrified of being placed in handcuffs. They frantically grabbed the handles of their cheap plastic bags and broken suitcases. They dragged their pathetic belongings toward the main street, forced to walk all the way down the massive driveway on foot. I stood completely still beside my beautiful black Porsche, watching them struggle against the freezing winter wind. I did not feel a single drop of sadness. I watched the heavy wrought iron gates slowly begin to close behind them, sealing them out of my kingdom forever. The heavy wrought iron gates were slowly beginning to close, sealing them out of my kingdom forever, when Chloe suddenly dropped her broken plastic suitcase on the freezing pavement. She turned around and rushed frantically back toward the property line, placing her hands on the cold metal bars just before they could latch shut. The security sensors detected her presence, and the massive gates groaned to a temporary halt. I stood perfectly still next to my black Porsche, watching her. She looked completely unrecognizable. The flawless golden child who used to mock my conservative business suits was gone. She was wearing cheap off-brand sweatpants and a bulky faded jacket that she had clearly dug out of a donation bin. Her signature blonde highlights were growing out, revealing dark, unkempt roots. Her skin was pale and her eyes were hollow, completely stripped of her arrogant, rich wife persona. She did not have her diamond earrings or her platinum credit cards to hide behind anymore. She was just a broken, exhausted woman facing the terrifying reality of complete poverty. "Maya, wait," she called out, her voice trembling and weak. I took a few slow steps toward the gate, stopping just a few feet away from her. Marcus and Helen watched from the sidewalk, too exhausted and defeated to intervene. Chloe gripped the iron bars, her knuckles turning white in the freezing cold. "I know you hate me," she whispered, tears brimming in her deeply sunken eyes. "I know I was horrible to you. I know I deserve everything that is happening right now. But we have absolutely nothing left, Maya. Dad needs his medication and Mom does not even know how to use a public bus. We spent our very last $10 on a cab ride to the courthouse yesterday." She took a ragged breath, her pride completely shattered. "I am not asking for $1 million, she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I am not asking you to let us move back into the house. I just need a few $100s. Just enough to buy some basic groceries and keep the heat on in our new apartment for the week. Please, Maya. I am starving. I am terrified. Just alone. I swear I will figure out a way to pay you back." I looked at the sister who had violently bullied me for over 3 decades. I remembered the countless times she had intentionally humiliated me in front of her wealthy friends. I remembered the Christmas dinner where she laughed in my face and told me I belonged at a basic desk job. I remembered the physical slap in my conference room when she viciously defended the white con artist who was actively stealing our family wealth. She expected me to feel pity. She expected the deeply ingrained family obligation to suddenly override years of severe emotional abuse. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I looked directly into her desperate, crying eyes. "You have hands, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "You have 2 perfectly capable hands and 2 working legs. You can go down to the local grocery store and fill out a job application just like everyone else. You can stand on your feet for 8 hours a day and bag groceries to pay for your father's medication." She stared at me, completely stunned by my cold refusal. "But I do not know how to do that," she whimpered, shaking her head helplessly. "I have never had a real job. I do not have a resume. Nobody is going to hire me looking like this." I leaned slightly closer to the iron bars. "Then you better learn very quickly," I replied sharply. "The real world does not care about your blonde highlights, Chloe. The real world does not care that you used to be married to a wealthy finance director. The real world only cares about what you can actually produce. And right now, you produce absolutely nothing. You are a 30-year-old woman who has never worked a single day in her entire life. It is time for you to finally grow up." Chloe let out a pathetic, broken sob, dropping her head against the cold iron bars. She realized I was not going to save her. There was no secret trust fund and no magical bailout coming. I was forcing her to face the brutal consequences of her own horrific life choices. I turned my back on her and began walking slowly toward my luxury sports car. "Maya, please," she screamed, her voice echoing down the empty street. "You cannot just leave us out here to die. We are your family." I reached the driver's side door of my Porsche and pulled a small black remote control from my coat pocket. I did not look back at the people standing on the sidewalk. I pressed a single red button on the remote control. The advanced security sensors immediately overrode the automatic safety pause. The massive, heavy wrought iron gates groaned very loudly as the powerful electric motors re-engaged with a sudden, violent jolt. Chloe shrieked as the heavy metal bars began sliding aggressively toward each other. She had to quickly jump backward onto the concrete to avoid getting her bare fingers completely crushed by the heavy closing mechanism. She stumbled awkwardly onto the freezing wet pavement, landing very hard next to her cheap broken plastic suitcase. Marcus and Helen scrambled to help her up, their wrinkled faces pale with terror, as the massive gates finally slammed shut with a deafening metallic crash that shook the ground. The heavy steel deadbolts automatically slid into their designated place, locking the entire estate down completely and securely. They were officially and completely locked out of my world forever. I opened my sleek car door, the warm, luxurious interior, welcoming me back instantly. I slid smoothly into the rich leather driver's seat and pushed the bright ignition button. I slid smoothly into the rich leather driver's seat and pushed the bright ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life, wrapping me in a comforting vibration. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the heavy iron gates. I watched them in my rearview mirror for just a brief second. My parents and my sister were standing on the frozen sidewalk, looking completely pathetic next to their broken luggage. Then I turned the steering wheel and accelerated down the street, leaving them completely behind. I did not look back again. That was the absolute last time I ever saw them in person. 6 months passed since that freezing morning in Buckhead. The blazing Georgia summer arrived, bringing a fresh wave of heat and a completely new chapter of my life. I was thriving in ways I had never even imagined possible. The massive historic mansion that had served as my childhood prison was completely gone. I kept my promise and hired the most aggressive commercial demolition crew in the entire city. I stood on the sidewalk one warm spring afternoon and watched with immense satisfaction as heavy yellow bulldozers completely leveled the thick brick walls. I listened to the loud, satisfying crash of the roof caving in, completely crushing the grand dining room into fine dust. The physical manifestation of my trauma was permanently wiped from the earth, replaced by a beautifully paved foundation for my highly profitable luxury townhome development. I felt a massive, heavy weight completely lift off my chest as the dust finally settled. My forensic accounting firm was absolutely booming. The massive publicity from successfully uncovering Bradley's offshore tax evasion scheme made me the most highly sought-after corporate investigator in the entire Southeast region. I had to quickly lease 2 additional floors in my downtown high-rise just to accommodate my rapidly expanding staff. My schedule was completely booked with highly lucrative contracts from massive Fortune 500 companies. But much more importantly, I was no longer alone. I had successfully surrounded myself with a genuine found family of brilliant colleagues and fiercely loyal friends. We hosted incredible Sunday dinners at my penthouse, filled with loud laughter and genuine mutual respect. There were no golden children, and absolutely no forgotten scapegoats at my table. We celebrated each other's victories without a single ounce of toxic jealousy. As for the people who actively tried to destroy me, the universe delivered a perfectly measured dose of poetic justice. Bradley was currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary located in the sweltering, suffocating heat of rural Alabama. The arrogant finance director, who used to wear custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedos, was now wearing a standard-issue beige canvas jumpsuit. He spent his long, miserable days pushing a heavy broom across the dusty concrete prison yard, completely stripped of his fake charm and his stolen wealth. His hidden offshore accounts were entirely emptied by the federal government, and his precious white mistress completely vanished the very second the FBI officially froze his assets. He was entirely alone, surrounded by concrete and barbed wire. My father Marcus barely avoided federal prison due to his rapidly declining health and his complete lack of remaining capital, but his ultimate punishment was arguably much worse for a man possessed by such massive pride. The former real estate king of Atlanta was now working 30 hours a week as a front door greeter at a massive chain hardware store. He wore a bright orange utility vest over his faded polo shirts, forced to stand on his feet and politely wave at the very same blue-collar construction workers he used to openly mock. Helen spent her long days trapped inside their cramped, unair-conditioned apartment, bitterly watching daytime television. She aggressively complained about her ruined life to anyone who would mistakenly listen, but her wealthy country club friends had completely blocked her phone number months ago. And then there was Chloe, the flawless golden child who used to brag endlessly about her platinum credit cards and her perfect fake marriage was forced to violently enter the unforgiving real world. She managed to secure a minimum wage job working the drive-through window at a local fast food franchise. A former colleague of mine actually spotted her there just last week. Chloe was wearing a greasy polyester uniform smelling of fried oil, aggressively arguing with her teenage shift manager because she was scheduled to work a double shift during a busy holiday weekend. Her designer blonde highlights were completely gone, replaced by a cheap, messy ponytail. The real world did not care about her manufactured elite status, and it certainly did not show her any mercy. I walked out onto the expansive private balcony of my luxury downtown penthouse. The warm evening wind gently blew through my hair. The sprawling Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, glittering brightly with millions of beautiful city lights. I held a chilled glass of expensive champagne in my right hand, feeling completely at peace with the empire I had built. I took a slow sip, savoring the sweet taste of absolute victory. I looked out over the glowing city and smiled, taking a deep breath of clean, fresh air. They thought they could ignore me, use me, and completely discard me when I was no longer convenient for their fake image. They treated me like a ghost in my own home, expecting me to quietly accept their abuse forever. They forgot one crucial detail. When you intentionally leave someone in the dark for 33 years, you really should not be surprised when they finally learn how to completely control the shadows. My name is Maya, and I took back absolutely everything they tried to steal from me. Have you ever had to legally dismantle a toxic family to finally find your peace? Let me know your story in the comments below. Keep your boundaries incredibly strong and keep your receipts even stronger. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Maya's story is a chilling but deeply empowering reminder that blood does not always equal loyalty. For over 3 decades, she was treated as the invisible, unworthy scapegoat by a family obsessed with superficial status and the illusion of perfection. The most profound lesson hidden within her journey of financial retribution is that your inherent worth is never dictated by the people who refuse to see it. When Maya's parents and sister looked at her, they saw a target for their own insecurities. They projected their toxic vanity onto her, blindly trusting a manipulative outsider simply because he fit their aesthetic and social agenda. However, instead of internalizing their psychological abuse, Maya channeled her pain into building an impenetrable fortress of independence. She teaches us a vital truth: we do not have to scream to be heard, nor do we need to beg for a seat at a table where we are fundamentally disrespected. Real power lies in silent, disciplined growth. While her family was busy polishing their fake crowns and drowning in their own deceit, Maya cultivated real skills, real wealth, and ironclad boundaries. She proved that when you stop seeking the approval of those who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your destiny. Her ultimate victory was not just buying back the physical land of her childhood trauma to bulldoze it. It was the realization that she never needed their validation to be successful in her own right. You are the architect of your own life, and sometimes the absolute healthiest choice is to permanently lock the gate on the people who constantly try to tear your walls down. If you are holding on to toxic relationships that drain your spirit just because of shared biology, I urge you to take back your power, set firm boundaries today, and start building your own peaceful empire.